How many of you know the Freedom Caucus? We should all know the Freedom Caucus. I'm delighted to be able to introduce you guys this morning to a friend of mine from Georgia, congressman there, who was a minister, got into politics, got to Congress, has joined the Freedom Caucus, is one of the Republicans, although he did tell me that last time he was on the ballot he ran unopposed, but typically you even see Republicans run against this guy in the primary because the Republicans say he's too conservative. He's been known to actually vote against the Republican Party when it wanted to spend too much money. It's just a profoundly good guy. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Congressman Jody Hice of Georgia.
Thanks, Erick. Great to be here
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now as Governor Abbott learned, the table's wobbly, so be careful with the water.
All right, we're good to go.
So I want to dive right in with you on this discussion because it seems like we're at a time where there is a division more and more frequently as the party finds its footing back having the White House. So where do you balance conservatism and being a member of the Republican Party when it's not the president, but it's Republican members of Congress who are spending lots and lots of money right now?
Yeah, listen, that's a great question. And by the way, thanks for having me, and thank you all for being here. Y'all are critical in what's happening in our country, and I really mean that sincerely. But listen, the problem, Erick, is not so much Republicans. I mean, if you really look at the Freedom Caucus, what we are doing is standing for the Republican platform.
Right.
I mean, and we're the only ones willing to do that. What you have is a bunch of people running as conservative Republicans, and then they get in Washington, they no longer stand for those principles. They're not willing to storm the hill on those principles, and they begin caving under leadership or whatever other pressure. So the question really becomes not so much conservatives versus Republicanism, or Republican Party, but conservatives versus people who say that they're conservatives but then won't stand on those principles. And therein lies a problem, and what we've got to do is make sure we get people to Washington who will do what they say they would do and that they will stand for what our party stands for.
How do we do that, though? I mean, you see people running all the time and they get elected for saying these things. I mean, just going off track to a little bit, I almost think one of the greatest things that could happen to the Democratic Party is if the Supreme Court did overrule Roe versus Wade, because we got a Republican Party that says it's pro-life, and yet leadership still blocks every effort you guys bring up to defund Planned Parenthood.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of exactly right. And there again, but our platform is pro-life. And then we get up there and we don't have people who stand for simple basics, such as the pro-life. You know, I think at some point we've got to come up with a way to pressure test people before they get elected. Because it seems like once they get to D.C., the pressure can be so intense. I mean, you're told everything that you've got to fall in line if you want to be on this committee or that committee, or you want funding here, that you're going to have influence if you fall in line. And of course that never happens. In order to get on this committee, you have to sell your soul, you got to give your voting card away, and that type of thing, and a lot of people end up falling for that. And I just believe somehow we have got to be able to vet people before they get on the ballot or before they become our nominee. Somehow they've got to be pressure tested before getting up there. And I'll leave that up to you to figure out how to do it.
Well, speaking of pressure testing, let's jump back into biography a little bit. How do you go from the pulpit into politics and to go from your past life now into being not just a member of Congress, but one of those troublesome members of the Freedom Caucus?
Listen, if it weren't for the Freedom Caucus, I'd be one of the most miserable people in the world. That is a group of warriors, and they're here for the right purpose. But listen, I was a pastor for 25 years. Never thought I'd be in politics to this point, although I'd helped people all along the way get elected. But we had a couple of major battles, both of which took on national focus. One was with the IRS. And the other with the ACLU. The ACLU came after us for a copy of the Ten Commandments in the courthouse, which our church put in our courthouse. And the other was the IRS censoring what can and cannot be said in churches and nonprofits with threat of losing tax-exempt status. And of course, Alliance Defending Freedom was the backbone of that that battle, but I was one of 33 pastors across the nation that challenged the IRS. And actually, well, it's interesting what happened. What happened in that particular battle, our church was filled with every media you can think of on this particular Sunday. All of them. And Nancy Pelosi's daughter was there. She was doing a documentary for HBO. But I preached a sermon on two presidential candidates, and from the pulpit endorsed one, urged our people not to vote for the other, and lights and clicks and flashes went out. But then the next day I actually sent a copy of that sermon to the IRS, and along with a letter, and said, here's what I did. I'm not trying to hide anything, but I don't believe I've violated the law. I believe your Johnson Amendment is a violation of the law, and I challenge you to come after me. The other pastors, the other 32, did something similar. The IRS did nothing, so we got together and said, let's do it again. And that actually turned into a movement these days, Pulpit Freedom Sunday, which many of you have probably heard of. It happens in the fall. Now thousands of churches across the country participate in the right to stand for the First Amendment. You don't waive your First Amendment right just because you're in church. And so that's where it came from.
It seems like so one of the reasons I wanted to do these conversations is they can be a little more freewheeling and go off where I wanted to go initially. And so let me do that with you here on this issue of religious liberty and stuff. The Supreme Court, I think, threw terrible precedents. Even though the First Amendment says you have the freedom to exercise your religion, seems more and more like they treat it as you have a freedom to show up on Sunday, but otherwise you can't be a Christian the other 6 days a week. In Texas, in Houston, you had the former mayor there demanding that pastors hand over copies of their sermons when she was opposing or trying to pass something that was very anti-religious there. Are you surprised, or how do you see this really public now anti-religious sentiment growing on the left that seems to be more open? It's always been there, I guess, but really open and boastful now.
Yeah, it's getting worse and worse. In fact, this is one of the primary issues that made me run for Congress. As you well know, you've been a part of my run for a long time. But repealing the Johnson Amendment has been a key thing. We have got to get churches and pastors and the faith community engaged. We've been told too long, separation of church and state and all this kind of stuff. And we wouldn't have even had this country had it not been for religious leaders holding the banner for a revolution. And we're not going to continue having this country unless the people of faith step up and exercise their First Amendment right. But we are living in an era now where it is massively under attack, and to the extent that really government is forcing their own religion, and that is secularism. And if you don't comply and you don't submit to the religion of secularism, then you're basically going to be silenced, or the attempt will be to silence you. So this is something that, we're in the fight of our life for our country. And right at the core of that, one of the centerpieces of that battleground is the First Amendment and religious liberty, and being able to live your faith out loud, not just within the four walls of a church building.
One of the things, particularly people on the left and the media, fixate on now is evangelical support for the president. Just on the character issue alone, where do you, as both a member of Congress and as a pastor, come down on, or how do you view your alliance with both the political party, the Republicans, and the president, in particular, when either he or the Congress decide they're going to do something that principally, as a conservative, you don't necessarily want to go along with that? How do you rack that up mentally?
Yeah, listen, I can't tell you, Eric, how many times in some of these conversations I've called you and asked about, I was not really prepared for the difficulty of making some votes. Because being on as a pastor and as a radio talk show for 12 years, we have votes, let me put it this way, we have votes that have within the bill things I've been fighting against for decades. And within the very same bill has things I've been fighting for decades. And I cannot tell you how many times I pace in my office a lot and literally just crying out to God saying, what am I supposed to do with this? You got to vote yes or no, and it's kind of darned if you do, darned if you don't kind of a thing. And so, yeah, that's a real battle. But let me just kind of cloak it by saying this. We are dealing with issues, I'm convinced, in our country these days that cannot be fixed politically alone. We are dealing with issues that we have a spiritual crisis in this country as well as a political and economic crisis, or wherever you want to tag it. And you can't, just the hatred, the language, the rhetoric, you can't politically fix that. Those are things that require change from the inside out. And I just desperately believe that we need a spiritual awakening in this country as well as a political one. And that's the heart of it.
We have had these conversations before, and I know this is something that has been on your heart for a long time. The people putting so much trust and faith in Washington, and when one election doesn't go your way, you become angry and bitter, and people are ignoring their local community and their local politics and changing things at the local level and the school board level. And how do you think a Republican Party in power in Washington, where it becomes the center of the universe for the Republican Party, but what can the party do to decentralize when it gets so much right now from being centralized?
Yeah, great point. I will never forget the first time I went to speak at the GOP in the largest county in my district, a county that has over 800,000 people at that time. And it was a Republican county. I thought, man, there's just going to be tons of people here. I was shocked, Eric, to see there was only about 30 or 35 people in attendance. And I left that meeting saying, here's a small group of about 30, 35 people that are literally impacting the direction of almost 1 million people in this county. And it does not take a lot of people. What it takes is to be present and to show up, be it at the school board meeting or the county commission meeting or city council meeting or whatever it may be. All politics at the end of the day is local. And I think we do have a fixation on what's happening in Washington, and at the same time we're losing what's happening right under our nose. And so people have got to engage at every level.
It had several people in the questions that were submitted, all wanted me to ask you and Warren Davidson both, what's your toughest vote? What vote can you recall that you struggled with the most before voting?
Well, it's great that Warren Davidson's here, and you've got a treat with him coming this afternoon, and he's a great member of the Freedom Caucus as well. But he replaced a guy named John Boehner, which was an incredible victory to go from Boehner to a Freedom Caucus.
And lots of Boehner's people didn't want him to replace John Boehner.
And so you talk about the toughest vote, and I look back, one of the things I ran on was to vote against John Boehner, which I did in the conference meeting when the speaker is really elected. In fact, I was one of only 3 that voted against him and did so loudly. They did it
now,
by voice
just for the record, there were a lot more who said they voted against him.
Yeah, but I mean, there were only 3, and it was a voice vote. And when they said all opposed, I can still in my mind hear my voice echoing all through that building. I said, no! And, he lost the vote. He won, I lost. And, after it was over, I'd been in Congress for 2 days. I was brand new on this. And the speaker vote, this is what I ran on, I'd vote against him. Well, I did. And everything I was told that the floor vote is just a show vote at this point. He's already been elected in conference. And so he called and asked if I would therefore support him on the floor, which I agreed to do. And
I, by the way, remember this phone call because I was walking through a mall with my kids, and you called to talk to me about it.
Oh, my goodness, that was the worst vote. I still get sick every time I thought about it, every time I think about it, because, I often wonder where were those who in the conference who voted against him on the floor when, in the conference, they voted against him on the floor. Where were they in conference when we had that vote? But just, that's probably not the kind of vote you're talking about, but for me, that is still the hardest vote I ever took because it made me sick voting for him on the floor.
Well, and it's interesting to me because you and I are not alone in these conversations about the grandstanding that goes on. And just going back full circle to our conversation, you have these people who they claim to be pro-life, yet they vote to fund Planned Parenthood. They claim to support limited government, but they're growing government. You were one of the members of Congress who stood firm and supported sequestration because it actually made real cuts in government, and yet thereafter, the Republicans who authored it ran out and attacked all of you guys who supported it. It can't be easy being you.
It's not. It really isn't. And, and that goes back to the difficulty of votes. So many times bills have the good, the bad, and the ugly in it all at the same time. And you've got to try to navigate your way through here. Is it a yes or a no? And Erick, I gotta say, all this ultimately, everything at the end of the day rises or falls on leadership. And that's why I support Jim Jordan. It's time that we do away with some of this stuff right now. It is unnecessary and to me inexcusable for us to even be voting on some of the bills that are brought to the floor. And leadership should not be put in. We ran on a conservative platform. We need to run on that, keep it, and not keep bringing all this garbage to the floor to vote on that, in my opinion, we shouldn't even be considering in the first place.
So one of the people here, and I think it's Annalise from Dayton, Ohio, if you're in the room, wanted to know, now being in Congress, what would be people's misperception? Or in other words, what did you learn going into Congress that you thought something else until you got there and had to disabuse yourself of how Congress actually works?
I think it would probably go back to what I've already said. On the radio, everything was black and white for me. I mean, I could get on there and, hey, Congress voted for this and they're doing that. Once I got there, I realized it's not nearly as easy to make some of those votes as I thought it was. And that's no question been probably one of the most eye-opening realizations for me personally. Beyond that, the swamp is deeper and wider and thicker and uglier than I could have ever imagined. And it takes a long time to figure out who you can trust, who you can't trust. And again, that goes back to a group like the Freedom Caucus. I'm telling you, we need more Freedom Caucus people elected.
We do.
And whatever we can do to support them, we need to do so.
I have had this thought, and several senators and I have had this conversation as well, that there does seem to be a leadership tactic to try to isolate conservatives and make them feel like they're alone, but can be welcomed into the fold if only they will vote certain ways. And so the need of a group like the Freedom Caucus to really have brothers in arms who are willing to have each other's back.
Oh, there's no question. And, as a member of Congress, and I'll say this even to the previous question because this is a stark realization too. As a member of Congress, I learned very quickly that I am less than 1/4% of the vote in Congress. And so as a member of Congress, it's very difficult to move the needle. And so the only way you can move the needle is if you have a coalition of like-minded people who bond together to try to move the needle towards more conservative solutions. And that's what we have in the Freedom Caucus. And as so many moderate Republicans continue to get defeated, with every election cycle, we're seeing more and more Freedom Caucus type people get elected. So our numbers continue to grow. You would think the party would start catching on at some point to start listening to the American people. We exist to be a voice for millions of Americans who believe they've lost their voice in Washington. And that's all people want from their representatives, to be our voice.
And yet, when the Freedom Caucus advances the agenda and the Republican Party has to embrace it, you don't get credit. And when you advance the agenda and it loses, you get the blame. Yeah. And it just seems like a no-win situation.
It is in a lot of ways. But, with time, all of that starts coming to light. But it is true. We are not fondly looked upon in Washington. And
neither am I.
Yeah, and that's okay. You realize, listen, a war is not a pleasant situation. And the stakes are high. Like I said, we're in the fight of our life for our country. And I'm not there and the Freedom Caucus members, we're not there to get accolades from people. We're here to take our country back. And with that, you're shot at a lot. But that comes with the turf of war, and so it is what it is. Let's go for it.
Yeah. I forget who I was talking to earlier about this, that you said we're here to take our country back, and people think, well, you've got Washington already. You've got the White House, you've got the Congress. And it's a buddy of mine who's actually, he's going to be joining us tomorrow, he's running for Congress, says we don't actually, conservatives don't actually have Congress.
That's right.
They're a minority within the majority party, and they're probably less actual conservatives than there are Democrats. How do you advance your agenda? I mean, we're looking at now, I think the projections are $1 trillion deficit, let alone the debt, from Republicans who for years were railing against Barack Obama's spending, and now suddenly are spending as quickly as the Democrats spent.
And how many ran on that platform that they were going to go spend more money in Washington?
Right.
Every one of them went up there saying, vote for me and I'm going to cut spending. And yet you get in this pattern of, there's votes in giving away money. And it just, we are on a death spiral economically if we don't get this thing under control. And Warren Davidson is one of the most brilliant minds we have in Washington in understanding this aspect of the battle, and you'll be blessed. But he actually made the comment the other day that we are the Republican wing of the Republican Party, and somebody's got to be.
Right. Yeah. It boggles my mind to have spent the last 8 years of Barack Obama assailing the rise of government, of big government, of the Leviathan, of Obamacare. And yet, I don't see that Republican leaders in Washington are doing any better. And if we tax people at 100% right now, we still wouldn't be able to close the gap.
Yeah, that's why we got to have. That's why we got to have the right leadership. You have the right leadership, then you have the right bills, which produce the right policy. You have the right people in key positions to keep the ball rolling. There's so much that is impacted. I mean, we keep year after year after year voting on these absurd, obscene omnibus bills because we can't get appropriations bills across the finish line. That's a problem both in the House and especially in the Senate. We have passed all last Congress of the appropriations bill in the House, got nowhere in the Senate. But until last year, we couldn't even do it in the House. And all these things rise and fall on leadership being able to do the job they're called upon to do.
So now, do you share the view, as some of your colleagues in the Senate do, that the Democrats are the opposition, but the Senate is the enemy?
Oh, we feel that way all the time. Listen, at some point, the Senate's got to wake up and realize that they've been voted on to do a job as well. And now's a good time to do that.
On the spending issue and this $1 trillion deficit, it seems to me Democrats were willing to lose their positions to be voted out of office to do Obamacare. And the only Republicans in Congress willing to be voted out of office to do the right thing are the Freedom Caucus, which are also the guys who are in the districts that are never going to vote them out for doing the right thing. But on the leadership level and the general level, you've got a lot of Republicans who they never want to do anything that might get them voted out of office, and makes it really hard to actually turn the corner.
It really does, Eric, and it can become disheartening when you see so much of leadership being led by checking the polls. Rather than doing the right thing. Whether it cost an election or not, we have got to maintain the greatest country this world has ever known. And the battle is intense right now, and it requires strong men and women of character and of leadership to pull it back.
Playing into this and just veering off into another subject before we wrap up, one of the criticisms I hear more and more about Congress from the left, from the right, from Republicans, from Democrats, is that Congress really has abdicated a lot of its leadership and power to the executive, and neither party has shown any desire to take it back. Democrats very conveniently now beg for it to come back when they ceded much of it to Barack Obama. Republicans don't seem interested. What should Congress be doing to get back its own power? Should it get back its own power from the president?
Oh, it absolutely should. That's why we have three branches. And it's not just the executive branch. I mean, a lot has been given to the judicial branch as well. And we have three equal branches by the genius of our forefathers that gave us this so that we could keep one another in check and not have an overlapping. The problem is once you surrender some authority, it's extremely difficult to take it back. But you're right, over decades there's been little tidbits of surrender, surrender, surrender. And I think a lot of that for selfish reasons. People didn't want to take tough votes and take those tough votes back to their constituents. And so they said, well, we'll let you handle this. And now we're getting ourselves in a situation that it's difficult to take back the constitutional authority that we should have never relinquished to begin with.
And you've got a situation where my bully pulpit these days is as much policy agreement as I have with the White House, this tariffs issue, and a lot of Congress says tariffs bad, but we're not going to take back our power on even this. From that to an out-of-control bureaucracy that, I mean, you do have this bureaucratic infighting where you've got a lot of career civil service agents who are civil servant agents who are Democrats who do their best to obstruct a free market agenda even with the President of the White House, and yet Congress, the leadership doesn't seem to want to fight any of those fights.
And you know, that's the swamp. That's part of the definition of what we're dealing with. I think the President is doing a great job. He is doing what he said he would do. But he is doing a lot of things that really belongs to Congress to do, and that is some of that authority that we've got to deal with. How do you work with this? Because you're right. What happens when a Democrat is in the White House? Then all of a sudden you've got this whole thing going on. That's why with the three branches that are supposed to have their respective areas of authority, and it needs to remain that way.
Congressman Jody Hice, you fight the good fight constantly. And I appreciate the phone conversations we have all the time. I know you struggle over votes, and I suspect most members of Congress who are principled struggle over votes more than most people realize. And thank you for sharing some of that with us today here.
Well,
Thanks for all you do.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
God bless you. Thank you. Appreciate
Thank you
you
very
so
much.
much.
Thanks for coming.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Congressman Jody Hice.